Typically in economics, we are really concerned with what and how and for whom to produce. I'll get to the details of that if you're not familiar with economics. But not a lot of us ask questions about where. And that is really the focus of geographical economics. So I briefly want to talk a bit about this to give you an idea, first off, how do economists think, just generally, and then how do economists think about space, cities, towns, and where economic activity occurs. But these days, does geography determine economic growth and development, or do institutions determine economic growth and development? That's sort of, the debate has moved in favor of the institutions these days. So you don't find a lot of people arguing that it's all about the place anymore. Most people say the place is less important, it's the way that society organizes itself once they are wherever they are. But you can imagine behind this is still a question of initially people had to somehow survive where they were, and you couldn't really start up the core of your civilization where it's really dry or really cold or any sort of a climatic extreme. So the world as we know it started at where you could easily find animals that you can domesticate, where there were grains that you could domesticate. So in that sense, geography is always important. Within countries, between cities and towns, that's where we're thinking about what drives economic growth and development, and what role does the spatial element of these activities play in the story. It's also a story of an urban world emerging. So currently there are more people living in urban areas than ever before. This will be stuff that you're already familiar with. And you can see the growth there, exponential. And over time, the projections are that people living in the smaller towns and smaller cities, they're moving to the even bigger ones. So hopefully, in some distant future, we'll look like the Jedi home world, just one big urban planet. You're supposed to no. So in economics, we are mostly assuming that it's occurring in the void, some featureless plane out there like space. And no one really worries about where is this happening. And luckily though, there are people who are a bit concerned. The World Bank says the most important correlate of your welfare is where you are. So if you want to say what explains whether people are rich or whether people are poor, if you know where they are, you already know a lot about whether they are rich or poor. Most places, almost nothing happens. And then where stuff do happen, it's a lot. That's the thing, is economic activity, people, they are agglomerated in places. And then for the rest, there's really nothing much happening. There's a good reason why economic production is concentrated. So every now and then you do find policymakers who say we should decentralize and move stuff to the periphery. Typically that fails. There are very few, if I can't think of any examples at the moment, of successful decentralization. We'll get to the forces that causes agglomeration, and you'll see why they are as strong as they are. So to work against those forces is really tough, and the cases where governments try that, they typically lean against the wind with taxpayers' money, which ends up getting wasted. People typically migrate to greater density. If you're already quite rich, learned, and successful, you might say, I will become the accountant of this small little town and I will grow rich from the farmers, or something like that. But that's not really a strategy that everyone else can also follow. And so I'm going to rusticate myself to rural areas and become successful. If you're really serious about being successful, you need to move to that next level. So if you're studying in Potch, you need to go to Pretoria. If you're already in Pretoria, you probably need to go bigger than that. Typically, as transport costs fall, you find more trade, more specialization. If you're decentralizing, you're basically undermining this one key feature of the nature of production, is that production works better if it's big. When you think about Europe, it's like chock full of people. In the US, it's the vast open spaces. But the US cities are really agglomerated. And they ascribe an amazing 45% of the variation in productivity between the US and Europe to the fact that you have these bigger cities. I like this bit at the end where they say, innovation requires an ever larger crowd of experts, preferably working in the same garage. The type of knowledge that is produced in close proximity to other people, That's where the real increasing returns are. You can work from anywhere. Why do you need to be in Cape Town and pay like $30 for coffee? It's not necessary. And his argument is that it's even more necessary now than ever. Distance, yes, it's not as big a thing as it used to be because we now have modern transport technology. But that doesn't mean that face-to-face contact is not important anymore. He thinks it's even more important now than it used to be in earlier times. The biggest mess made by the apartheid government. They are big messes, but the fact that you have now completely messed up spatial planning forever is difficult to turn around. So now you have poor people living at the periphery of the country and at the periphery of the cities. It's not something that you can change in 10 years or 20 years or something along those lines. It's a legacy that's going to be with you for ages. The way around it is to pour as much money as you can into transport infrastructure in a smart way, not more roads. So any country who says, no, the foreigners should get out and we have no time for them, they are limiting their options in the labor market, they're limiting sharing, matching and learning. The hipsters of the east side of London. So he says the whole story is that people mock them with their beards and their single gear bikes and stuff like that. And so why are they so silly, these hipsters? But they sort of took the place of the yuppie types of the previous era that used to work in the banks and finance before they shrunk away a bit. And the guy says, well, in a way, the hipsters are more sustainable than the finance types ever were. Mainly because they're not spending their money on Porsches and champagne. They crowd together in small little rooms. They share. They don't buy material goods all the time. They're not wasting their money on things as much. They work in these creative industries. They actually have a sort of light environmental footprint with their single fixed gear bikes. Now you need a planning solution to say, how are we going to accommodate this? You want people with very low incomes who can walk to work, they should have access to those spaces, but you also need the hipsters and with their fixed gear bikes and the yuppies in their big 4x4s. Getting that mix right is probably the biggest challenge of cities in the future. If you're already living in Parktown, Parkhurst, any of those sort of neighborhoods, people come along and they say, oh, we're going to densify. Say, no, please don't, we can't densify. I bought this 5 million rand house because I like leafy suburbs and a big yard and I have room for my dogs and stuff like that. You don't want a big high-rise building right next to you. In a way, though, the problem is it's inefficient. It would have been much better if you can concentrate people together. They can easily take their Uber car. They can easily jump on the train or on the tram or whatever public transport. If they're spread out across the whole of the Rand or spread out across the whole of the Cape, it's immediately a more high-cost solution. The problem is that the cost of living far away from agglomeration is not properly captured and paid by people. The fact that you can live on half an acre somewhere and driving in your big SUV is because you're not really seeing the cost of that every day. If you paid the proper environmental cost of the carbon that you're emitting and heating your McMansion, you would have lived in the city. And I think in South Africa, that's people living in Pretoria and working in Joburg. I don't know why they would do that to themselves, but there are loads of them driving every day. It's like they're proud of getting up at 4, driving on the highway. It's a whole culture.